We're going to be talking about some basics of genetics and heredity today. To give you a little bit of background, we're going to be talking about this gentleman here. His name is Gregor Mendel, very famous person. You definitely need to memorize the name Mendel. You will hear it again. He was a monk in the early 1800s. He was an Austrian monk. If you don't know what a monk is, just to give you a quick background, a monk is a religious person, a male religious person that devotes their life to their religion, and they usually take like a vow of poverty and obedience, and in some orders they even take a vow of silence, which means they don't talk, they just pray. So basically, in his monastery, Gregor Mendel was in charge of the gardening. So he grew all of the food for the rest of the monks that lived there. That was his job. And so he obviously, because he was a monk and he was praying, he had time on his hands. So he, on his own, my point of telling you this story is he wasn't a classical scientist. He wasn't trained to work in a laboratory. He was doing this out of a hobby and just interest. And this is interesting because a lot of times science and scientific realization is based on people who are just curious and are experimenting about certain things. You don't necessarily need to be working in a lab. So Gregor Mendel was not working in a lab. He was growing food for the other people that he lived with. And he said, you know what? I'm going to try some experiments and see what's going on. He might not even have called them experiments. He just was curious. So he designed different experiments to kind of see what was happening with these flowers. And I'm going to talk about those in the next couple of slides. All right. So his experiments were aimed at addressing one of the most fundamental issues concerning heredity. How are traits passed from their parents to their offspring? What are the patterns? Okay. So he really, well, we're talking about what he worked with, but at Mendel's time, there were basically two popular ideas about heredity. And by the way, they were incorrect, but they thought about something called the blending hypothesis. And this is an idea that stated that the genetic material of two parents would blend together. So a red flower and a white flower would create a pink flower. And then there was this other idea, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on because they were incorrect, but it was called the inheritance of mutations. This one's really interesting. So people believed that the traits were passed from parents, were basically the traits present in parents were modified as they are used or not used and then passed down to offspring. So for instance, there was fossil evidence that there was an ancestor of giraffes that were much shorter necks than the present day giraffes. So people believed that when they found these fossils of these ancestors of giraffes with the shorter necks, they thought, oh, as the parent giraffes must have stretched their necks to reach leaves, then their necks, because they were stretching their necks, their babies would have longer necks over and over. This is not true. If that was true, that would mean that if your dad ever shaved his face, that you'll never, as a boy, get hair on your face. Or if your mom dyes her hair, then whatever color she dyes her hair, you're going to have that color hair when you're born. So that's not true. All right. So Mendel's experiment. So in order to complete this experiment, Mendel needed to choose an organism that had the following characteristics. Now, by the way, again, he was not doing this on purpose. It was more of a hobby, but these just by chance were some of the characteristics that he chose for, and it wound up working out really well. Okay, so they should be basically an organism that's not huge, because we don't have a lot of room for it to live. It has to have a short lifespan so that He can look at multiple generations. It has to be inexpensive to take care of because he's a monk. So, he doesn't have millions of dollars to buy laboratory equipment. It has to produce many offspring in a relatively short period of time and has to be easy to experiment with. So I think I mentioned to you earlier what he did, what his job was. He grew food for the rest of the monks. So what do you think would have been something that he might have picked to do this experiment? He picked a pea plant. Again, who knows why he picked the pea plant? Because I don't know if he was thinking about all of these things when he picked the pea plant, but they fit into that category. And it just by chance was really fortuitous that he picked the pea plant. All right. So this is what the peas look like. Sometimes we see them in a pod. Usually, you guys, when you get them, they're already popped out of the pod. And the flower of the pea plant looks like this. Okay. So Mendel chose the pea plant for his experiment because he's noticed that there are a variety of colors and different traits within the pea plant. He could easily control the matings through cross-pollination. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And each pea plant has both male and female reproductive organs. So just to go back, I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you before, but inside the flowers of the plant are where the reproductive organs are. And some plants have both male and female present in one flower, which is true for the pea plant. But in some plants, they don't. So this was lucky for him that he picked the pea plant because it does have the male and female reproductive organs in there. And we'll talk about what those are. Okay, I think. All right. If I don't get to it today, we'll talk about it another time. All right, so these are the traits. So he basically divided his garden into multiple sections for this experiment. He did multiple experiments, multiple things that he looked at. So he took a section of the garden where he experimented with just the seed. He took a section of the garden where he did an experiment looking at flower color. He did a section of his garden, and this is obviously it was a big garden. He did a section of the garden where he experimented the pod and two different traits for the pod, and we'll talk about what that is later. And then he did a section of the garden where he looked at two different traits for stem. So this was a section, this was a section. So he did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He really did 7 sets of, it says right there, 7 sets of characteristics. All right. So he was looking at, so some of these pea seeds could either be gray and round or white and wrinkled. So he crossed them. Some of the seeds inside, when you cut them out, the inside's called cotyledon. Some are yellow, some are green. He could look at flowers. That's probably an easy one to look at. Yellow pea flowers versus the purple. He looked at the pea pods, whether they were like smooth or constricted, which means like you can kind of see those little bumps. And then he also looked at the pea pod color, whether they were yellow or green. Then he looked at the stems, where the flowers were placed. So sometimes the pea flowers are terminal, which means they're on the top, and some are axial, which means they're kind of like on the sides. And then he also looked at pea plant sizes. Sometimes the stems were over 6 feet tall, so that would be way taller than me. And some were short, less than 1 foot. All right, so I'm going to read this to you, and then we'll pick the right answer. Pea plants were particularly a good choice to use in Mendel's experiment for all of the following reasons, except, so which one is not true? Peas show easily observed variations in a number of characteristics, such as pea shape and flower. That's true. It is possible to completely control matings between different pea plants. That is true. It is possible to obtain large numbers of offspring from one cross. That is true. So it must be D. Peas live for an unusually long time. And that is not true. You can grow peas very, very quickly. So he was able to do this experiment over and over and over and over again and do generation after generation and generation. Because like if he was doing this with dogs or humans, it would take a long time before the dogs or the humans would be old enough to be able to reproduce. Peas, very short. Weeks and weeks before they are able to reproduce. Not bad. Okay. first experiment that he did, this was called a monohybrid cross. The prefix mono means one. The word hybrid, I'm sure you're familiar with hybrid cars. Hybrid means a cross between two different traits. So in a car, it's usually like an electric car, a car that's electric and gasoline. Hybrid in genetics is when you're looking at two different traits. So the hybrid here would be a purple flower crossed with a white flower. And so he just looked at one, in this one plant, he only looked at one trait. He was looking at flower color. So mono, one color. He was just looking at whether it's purple or white. Hybrid means crossing a purple with a white. Okay, so let me read these to you. So one of Mendel's experiments looked at flower color. A pea plant can either have a purple or a white flower. So for this experiment, he crossed a purple flower with a white one. This is called a monohybrid cross because the parent plants differ in only one trait, their flower color. I'm going to move this because I can tell you can't see everything. Sorry. The results of this cross. So this is the parent generation. That's why it's labeled parents. And then F1 means first filia. It's a Latin word for first generation. So purple and white were crossed, and all of the offspring were purple. So it was 100% purple. Okay. Then he took the second generation. He took that first generation to create the second generation. So he crossed F1 with an F1. So first filia, a purple versus purple. And then he did this, by the way, when he did this, he had 929 plants. Again, this is garden area. It must have been huge. So he crossed F1 with F1, and then he had 929 plants. Some of them were purple, and some were white. So for every 3 purple plants, he had 1 white. So there was a 3-to-1 ratio, we could say, 3 purple to 1 white. Or we could figure out what that is in percentages, and we could do that with these numbers. So out of the 929 plants, 705 were purple, 224 were white, or you probably already know this from math class, what percentage 3 out of 4 is. Okay, so what percentage were purple? So if we have 3 purple plants out of 4 total, that percentage would be 75. So 75% of the plants were purple. So write 75 there. All right. I'm going to skip this one. All right. So Mendel's, by the way, well, we'll talk about this right here. Does this support the blending hypothesis? And that's going to be no, because that white flower popped up, even though it looks like there was a blend here. Purple looks like it blended with white and created purple flowers. But that white flower popped up in that second generation. So that does not support the blending hypothesis. It was a hidden trait somewhere. So that's like for sometimes in your families, you might see, 2 parents with dark brown hair have a child with light hair, or 2 parents with dark brown eyes have a child with light eyes. That might be because a grandparent may have had light eyes, and that gene pops up later on in later generations. Okay, so let's interpret these results. So based on the results from this experiment, Mendel concluded that the trait for white flowers did not disappear in the purple plants, but instead the purple color factor was controlling the flower color. He also concluded that these plants must have carried 2 factors for the flower color. One represented purple and one represented white. So he was calling them factors, but really we're going to call them genes. So he said each parent must have carried a factor. And let's see. So a genetic cross in which the parents differ in only one trait is known as a blank cross. One trait. What word means one out of these? The answer is A, monohybrid cross. Remember, mono means one. All right, we're going to stop here because there's so much information. and I don't want to overload you. And we're going to do this little activity that might help you too. That'll be later. All right. So just to kind of review this, Mendel did not use these terms, but I'm going to throw them out there right now to help you. When we talk about genetics, we talk about dominant traits and recessive traits. So remember, we crossed the purple with the white, and in that first generation, all of the offspring were purple. That's because purple is dominant, and it basically hid that recessive gene. But all of these offspring must have a hidden recessive gene in here, because they got 50% from this parent, 50% from this parent. So there's that recessive gene hidden in there. So when they have offspring, that recessive white flower trait sometimes will appear again. And that's what this is. This is a recessive trait right here. This 75% is dominant, 25% recessive. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to throw out those words. He didn't use the words recessive and dominant, but we do know them now based on his experiments. So you may have heard about that in your everyday life when you talk about traits in yourself, whether you have, what color eyes you have, what color hair you have, what color skin you have. Some of these traits are dominant and some of these are recessive. In humans, it's much more complicated than it is in pea plants, but the terminology you may have heard. Okay, gonna stop here. Check for an exit slip.